Chapter 5, Voice Leading and Forbidden Parallels. First, let's talk about the 4 types of motion. Now, motion in music refers to the changing of pitch levels in the melodic line. And there are 4 classifications for motion when describing music written in 2 or more parts: parallel, similar, contrary, and oblique. Parallel motion, that involves 2 lines moving in the same direction. Like that, or similar motion is also 2 lines are moving in the same direction, but the interval might be changing, not always the same interval. Contrary motion, that's when lines move in opposite directions, something like this. Or oblique motion is lines are moving, but where one is stationary actually, and the other one moves. Now this is really important too, because if the rhythm is moving along in music, but the pitch don't change, in other words, they're staying on the same note, then we say that there is no motion. And that actually happens quite a bit in music. What we could do at this point is take a look at the different types of motion that are present in a 4-part chorale setting. And what we do is look at the relationship between any of the 2 voices. We can trace the motion between, let's say, the soprano and the alto, or the soprano and the bass, or between the alto and the tenor, or any 2 voices really. But what we're going to do in this piece here is just look at the motion that exists between the soprano and the bass. That's the outer voices. So first let's listen to this old 100, this hymn tune. There are actually quite a lot of different types of motion in this piece, a lot of contrary motion. But again, let's go and look from the beginning at the motion between the soprano and the bass. So first, we have the chord number 1 going to chord number 2. It's really the same chord, so NM, no motion. We go to chord number 3. The notes are moving in the same direction downward, but by different intervals. That's similar motion. Going to chord number 4, notice the notes are going in opposite directions. That's contrary motion. And then to chord number 5, same direction down, but by different intervals. That's similar. And then they go up. In that case, they're going up by the same interval, up a 4th. So that is parallel motion. This is the second chord in the second measure. Notice the notes went in opposite directions, contrary motion. And at the very end, contrary motion again. So again, if we had to summarize, we'd say that most of the motion between those voices actually is contrary motion. So you want to take a look at this chorale and ask yourself a few questions. For example, is each chord complete? Now, we don't have to look at every single chord, but let's look at a few of them. The first chord has a G, B, and a D. And yes, that is a complete 1 chord, actually. The second chord is the same. Here's the third chord, has a D, an F sharp, and an A. And yes, that's complete. You should go to each of the chords there and see, make sure each one has 3 notes. The next question is, what's doubled in each chord? We've already talked about the fact that when you have chords that are triads, those are 3-note chords, but you're doing it in 4 parts, one of those notes has to happen twice. So, what is the note that happens twice? Look at the first chord. G, B, D, G. So the bass note, the root tone, happens twice. Same thing in the second chord. The third chord, D, A, D, F sharp. Notice that the D happens twice. That's the bass tone, the root tone. The fourth chord, E, G, B, E. What note happens twice? The E, again, the bass note, the root tone. You should continue along and look at all those chords and confirm that that seems to be the case. The bass, which is the root tone, happens twice. Here's a question. Which voice seems to have the widest and the most frequent leaps? In other words, not just stepwise motion, but leaping. You could look at the melody. That's all stepwise. And then just one leap right there. But look at the bass. Leap, leap, leap up, step down, leap. You can see it's really mainly the bass that has the leaps, and especially those inner voices, the alto and the tenor, really don't. What's the largest leap that you see in the alto or the tenor voice? Look at the alto. There's a leap of a third. That's the biggest one you're going to see. Also look at the tenor, and you'll see that those inner voices really have very few leaps. They seem to be the most cohesive and scale-wise parts. What's the largest vertical distance that you see between any of the two voices? So this will take a little bit of examination, but take a look at that first chord. By vertical distance, I mean, let's say from the bottom note, the bass, to the tenor is a third, and then from the tenor to the alto is a third, and then from the alto to the soprano is a fourth. So there's nothing bigger than a fourth. If you go to the third chord, you'll see some bigger intervals. A fifth between the bass and the tenor, and then a fourth between the tenor and the alto. Do you see anything bigger than that? Actually, if we go to the second measure, look at the distance between the alto and the soprano. That's a sixth. I think if you look through this whole piece, you're not going to see anything bigger than an octave when you look at vertical distances. Can you figure out which chords are in close spacing and which ones are in open spacing? You should be able to do that. Remember, that involves just looking at the top three voices and looking at the interval between the soprano and the tenor. So, for example, the first chord, the distance between the soprano and the tenor is actually less than an octave. So that's close spacing. Same with the second chord. Third chord, the distance between the soprano and the tenor is less than an octave. At what point do you see a chord where that distance is an octave or bigger? Well, take a look at the second measure. You see the soprano is a G and the tenor is a G. Now that's an octave, so that's open spacing. And the next chord, that's the second measure. Second chord, notice the soprano is A, tenor is F sharp. Bigger than an octave, so that's open spacing. Do all of these voices fit within their ranges? Do you remember the ranges of the different voices? You can go back to the previous chapter to check that, but I think you'll see that they are all in their ranges. Every voice seems to be in its own range, and they don't seem to cross into other folks' ranges, so that's another rule that we'll see a lot with four-part writing. So here's a few rules that we can derive just by looking at this example. Number one, use all complete chords. Make sure you've got 3 pitches whenever you write in this style. Double, this is rule number 2, double the root tone of all root position triads. That's the note that's going to be in the bass if it's root position. The alto and tenor lines should be mostly smooth and stepwise. That's what we call the inner voices. Keep those melodic leaps in the alto and tenor lines to a minimum, never larger than a fourth. Next rule, the harmonic interval between the adjacent voices should be an octave or less. Sometimes we call that the vertical distance. This only applies to the upper 3 voices and not to the distance between the bass and the tenor, which sometimes is much larger than that. Next, use a variety of chord spacings. open and close. Next, use a variety of different kinds of motion. We've seen a lot of contrary motion. That's good. Similar motion, parallel motion, these are all good types of motion. Next, keep the voices in their ranges and maintain their order. Keep them in their ranges so that they are distinct, that you can tell what ranges they are in. Don't cross the voices. Don't cross a voice into, let's say, the tenor part, have it go higher than the alto, for example. That would be called crossed voices. Let's take a look at this example. This is example 5.5. It actually has a lot of mistakes. Not nearly as smooth and as following the rules that we saw back in example 5.4. So let's take a look. Okay, there are 7 chords. Let's take each one individually. Chord number 1. First of all, take a look at that tenor part. That's a high G. Compare it to the alto. Can you see that the tenor voice is singing higher than the alto? That's called crossed voices. We don't want to do that. That would be considered a voice leading mistake. Take a look at chord number 2. Can you see that the alto, moving into chord number 2, jumped up a fourth, and the tenor, moving into chord number 2, jumped down a fourth, and then going into the next chord, jumped down a fifth. That's very much unlike the way that altos and tenors move. We want to keep those voices smooth. We don't want them to jump. We certainly don't want them to jump more than a fourth. Look at chord number 3. In chord number 3, that melodic interval in the tenor is definitely too large. Moving down a fifth. We never want it to move more than a fourth. Also, the harmonic interval between the alto and the tenor is too large. It can't be more than an octave. Take a look at chord number 4. Here, the melodic interval is too large in the alto, moving from the C in the previous chord to the E in this chord. We don't want those inner voices to move more than a fourth. Also, you might want to notice that the chord at 4, take a look at those notes. C, C, and then in the alto, E, and C in the soprano. Well, what's missing? If this is a C triad, C, E, G, then there's no G. We don't want to have a note missing. We don't want to have incomplete chords. Chords 5, chord 6, they're okay. The voice leading is pretty smooth. We have complete chords, not a problem. But take a look at number 7. Take a look at what the alto does. It goes from a D to an A, and the tenor goes from a B to a D. Do you notice on the last chord, they've crossed their positions? Again, that's cross voicings, and we don't want to do that. One other thing on that chord number 7, take a look at the lowest note in the bass, that low D. That's, listen to me try to sing that note. That's a G, F, E. My voice doesn't go down there. I'm not a bass, but even a bass might have a little trouble with that note. You might recall back earlier in a previous chapter that the lowest note you should put in the bass is E. So that note is too low for the range of the bass. Take a look at Check Your Understanding 5.1. In this example, it's really similar to what we just did. A lot of mistakes. Go through and see if you can identify similar mistakes to what we just looked at.